fake the whole thing and just say a welcome a third time. And this time we'll really make a start. So last time I called it means, motives and betrayal. This time it actually all alliterates with bread, blood and betrayal. We're still in that period. We're looking at the process, the season as Judas is in the has made the choice to either force Jesus' hand, or that he's disappointed and wants something to happen, something to change, and started to kind of hand over in his heart. And that process has been going on. So I've called it bread, blood and betrayal, because we're looking at the Last Supper, which comes into these things again. And then Jesus will be heading out from the Last Supper towards Gethsemane. So as we kind of pick it up today then in Matthew 26 verse 17. So on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, now quite a few of you have gone through the walkthrough of the resurrection accounts, and so you'll be aware that this, alongside all three of the synoptic gospels, Luke in particular kind of makes it even more explicit, but they all present Jesus eating a Passover on the first day of unleavened bread, which was seen for huge numbers of years as being the most problematic thing in the New Testament, because people were so sure of the kind of the way in which Judaism worked in the first century, that they couldn't read this without saying it doesn't make sense. This phrase, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? So the Passover and the first day of unleavened bread are on the same day. And because in normal Judaism, as we think about it, I say normal Judaism as we experience it today, and you look at the calendars, the first day of unleavened bread happens after the day you eat the Passover. So in the evening, you eat the Passover, and then the whole day passes, night comes, the day comes, and there's another evening, and the next day starts, and that day is the first day of unleavened bread. And as we've constructed before, and you probably heard me say it before, the only way in which you can have the first day of unleavened bread and the Passover happening at the same time is, in fact, you're not using an evening to morning calendar. And there are bits of the Old Testament that look like establishing that morning to evening. But actually, if you, as we've analysed and looked at the study a lot more, you see that all of those things come from a later period of Judaism, which certainly predates Jesus, but it gives you an interesting conflict in that and you can even see in kind of parallel passages in the Old Testament how the shift of the calendar, which is now understood to have happened when the Israelites were in exile in Babylon. So when they're in Babylon, the Babylonians use a lunar calendar like the Jews do, but they measure the day they measure the new year with the disappearance. Is it the disappearance of with the arrival of a new moon? That was it. Which you see first thing in the evening, you see. And so the first thing in the evening, if you look, you see a new moon. That's the beginning of the new month. And therefore the day starts in the evening. Whereas prior to that, it seems, following the Egyptian calendar, which similar to the Babylonian, similar to the Jewish calendar, is a lunar calendar, the civic calendar. All of them have a kind of an alternative religious calendar as well, but the general cycles of things, you find it's the same basic pattern, but there the day is measured from morning through morning to morning rather than evening to evening. And so in Jewish history, you kind of have this shift. And so it seems, and has been kind of reconstructed now to, I think, a pretty good level, that all three synoptic gospels, they actually do make sense. It's not really that problematic as long as you see the Galileans are still using the pre-exilic version way of measuring the day from morning till morning. Because if you measure morning to morning, the instructions that are given for Passover, which is you eat the Passover after sunset, you see, in the Babylonian version, after sunset's the next day, and then it's normally but equally the first day of unleavened bread starts after sunset too, I think. but you put them together, and in the one calendar you have a complete day and then unleavened bread starts, whereas in the other, the first meal you eat in the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the Passover, which you eat with unleavened bread, which makes sense to me, you see. So that's a very complicated way of me trying to say something which you probably have to see sketched out. But fundamentally, for the unleavened bread to appear on the same day as Passover and be the same day, which is the way that Luke puts it, it's on the same day that the Passover lambs are sacrificed. So the Passover lambs are sacrificed, you eat the Passover, and unleavened bread all starts on the same day if you're running morning to morning. But if you're running evening to evening, then the Passover lambs are sacrificed on one day. Then it comes the evening, which is the next day, and you eat the Passover. And then you start the day of unleavened bread the day after the day the lambs are sacrificed, but that was a full day later. And so you get this kind of strange mix-up. So I think it's very, very clear and it's very simple. And those that want to argue otherwise, it seems pointless to me. but people do, because John kind of presents, as we know, Jesus being sacrificed at the same time as the Passover lambs are being sacrificed. But actually, it's such a vast feast with people coming from all different parts of the empire, some coming from Egypt, some coming from Babylon, because there are Jews in both places now, and some coming and coming even from the east and further away. But they're all coming together. It seems that there's a bit of flexibility in terms of exactly which calendar is being celebrated, which is probably convenient for the temple because it gives them more days to get all the sacrifices done. But the final day on which you can celebrate Passover is done according to the temple calendar. So hopefully this is it makes some sense. So it looks like, as I said, that Matthew, Mark and Luke and Jesus is probably celebrating using the original calendar. It's probably more true in Galilean areas because Galilee was an area that had already been taken into exile before Judea gets taken into exile into Babylon. So it's mainly the Jewish Jews, the Judean Jews, who are most likely to use the temple calendar, whereas Galilee, which is further up, would be much more in line with the Samaritans in terms of they're still using an earlier version. So that's probably enough said about that. But the disciples then, they're coming to Jesus. It gives us this little space for Jesus to genuinely eat the Passover according to the way that the scriptures describe it, because they don't tell you which calendar to use. They're using it according to a calendar that has been used in Israel. It is a formal one. It fits with the scripture and so on. It's a totally biblical Passover, and yet at the same time to be crucified on Passover. So he kind of fulfills two things by this split of calendars. It's a nice way of God fulfilling Old Testament prophecies, all at the same time, effectively having two dates for Passover. So anyway, coming back to the story, because that wasn't really the point. We often do that a bit more when we look at all the Gospels together. In asking Jesus, Matthew is kind of making clear, because he's already described Judas having approached the temple authorities with a view to the betrayal of Jesus, to be captured and taken at a time which is private. And the Passover meal would, in theory, be a good opportunity to actually arrest Jesus, because it wouldn't be in a public space. It would be in a room somewhere with a small group of people, just 12, 13, 14, a handful of folks eating the Passover meal together. That would be a good time. But the way Matthew is presenting this, the decision as to where they're going to eat is only made on the day, whereas there have been opportunities for Judas. And the way it's actually made, it's not clear to the majority of disciples exactly where the Passover is going to be eaten. And so Judas at this stage has made the decision, but he's unaware of where the Passover is going to take place. And so he's not able to turn Jesus over to the authorities actually at the Passover meal. So we go on. So he said, go into the city, and I've just translated the word now as you'll know who, and tell him the teacher says. Now, most of the other Gospels, I say most of the other Gospels, so Mark and Luke give us a bit more information, as does, I think, John. I have only checked before sitting down exactly what comes from where. Matthew and I just checked Mark and Luke just a second ago before we started, but Matthew presents going to the city, and he hides the name. The phrase he actually uses, which you'll see translated "such a man" in the King James, or sometimes you'll see "a certain man," but "a certain man" is quite specific. It kind of, it hides the name, but the actual Greek word that is used. I'm just trying to remember what it is now. I can't remember now. But it actually, I can tell you what it is, because I have my text in front of me. So let me just quickly. I'll go and tell you, because yeah, there we go. Okay. The Greek word is dyna, G1170 if you're using Strong's, which is actually derived from deilos, which is G1169. So one digit before in kind of Strong's way, single digit before. Deilos actually means to be timid or fearful. And dyna is a kind of a way in which you describe someone cautiously. So if you want to identify someone, but you want to be a bit circumspect about who they are, you'd use the word dyna, as it is here. Now it's unique in the entire New Testament. It's never used anywhere else. So Matthew here, he is referring to a certain man, a certain individual, but he's deliberately obscuring that individual's name. And that makes sense if, as I've always kind of put to you here, Matthew is what has been written for the Jerusalem church in the early days, right at the beginning of the church's ministry, where actually Matthew is quite regularly a bit circumspect about the names of people who other Gospels, as you go on, become more and more confident in identifying. And here in Matthew's Gospel, we have it really kind of clear in that he uses a word which is, got to be cautious about this, it's so-and-so, it's probably a bit of an open secret. It's that guy. It's such a man, the way that King James puts it. It's that guy that you probably know who I'm talking about, but we've not written it down on a piece of text that can be captured, that can be found by an inquisitor like Paul, who goes from house to house. If he kind of comes across a text that actually has names on it, he will use those names and track down the individuals involved. And as we are aware, as we go through the rest of the New Testament, the house for the Last Supper becomes quite a key place for the gathering of the early church. So it's a kind of a place that Jerusalem Jews in the 40s, as you run into the 40s, are going to be cautious about. And so Matthew deliberately kind of obscures the name. There are other ways of referring to a certain person obscurely, but often you do that to be derogatory about them. So-and-so, i.e. what a useless so-and-so. This is not a derogatory one. It's someone it's a way of kind of standing in for a name that probably people know, but I'm just being a bit cautious about it. So I quite like that personally, because it kind of fits with my own kind of take on the role of the Gospels and how they've been written and so on. So he said, go into the city and up to you'll know who. In other words, it's someone you will probably recognize, is probably the way I would guess it. And tell him, the teacher says, my time is near. I'll keep the Passover with you, with my disciples. And there's another interesting little bit here in Matthew's text, which is not so clear in Mark or Luke, which is that he actually states that he will eat the Passover with, because a lot of translations add into the mix, my time is near, I will keep the Passover in your house or with your house. They add the word house, which isn't there. It's the only time that the with you phrase, I can't remember what it is now, is kind of used over 100 verses in the Gospels, and this is the only time that an extra word, rather than it just being you, is added to it, because actually it doesn't say with your house or in your house; it's with you. I'm going to eat the Passover with you. Now, why do I mention that? Well, part of the reason for mentioning it is there. Just which way around to say this is. There is a theory that was being put forward by Richard Balcom, and I don't subscribe to it, but I think it's worth noting. And he sees this kind of sense of with, and he then sees the host of the house as being John the elder, who he sees as one of the 72. Rather than John the Apostle. I've vacillated, as many of you will know, between who writes John's Gospel. Is it John the Elder, and is that John the Elder different from John the Apostle? And he sees that the beloved disciple in John's Gospel is actually the disciple that is here hosting the Last Supper. As I've weighed it up, I prefer. I think there's something in it. But I prefer a kind of a slightly fuzzier approach, because actually, if you look in Luke's Gospel, he says, "Go and you find a man who's carrying water, and then he takes you to the house, and you ask the master of the house," is the way it's sometimes translated in Luke, but it could be the household head, i.e. the head of the family. So you ask the head of the family for permission to eat there. And so you're putting all of the Gospels together with their little nuances. Matthew's avoided the whole thing because he's just said, go and find a person and you'll know who I'm talking about. but people who've found this piece of paper that you've got haven't got his name written down, so they can't track him down. You'll know who I'm talking about. He's avoided the fact that actually as they go in, there's a kind of somebody waiting carrying a pitcher of water. We've looked at, when I've done these things more widely, the role of men carrying water being associated with the Essenes, who because as often they've practiced celibacy, no marriage, and therefore male and female could perform the same functions. We've looked at all of those sorts of things. I'll ignore that for the moment, but there's someone there as a kind of a sign that they recognise or they connect with, who's carrying a pitcher of water. He takes them to a house, and arrangements are made, and it seems like the master of the house will probably be hosting the meal, the Passover meal, which means he's likely to be there. And then, interestingly, when we get to Mark's Gospel, Mark tells us about a man in the Garden of Gethsemane, who's kind of lodging there. There will be outbuildings because it's actually a working oil press. We're going to get there tonight. Who's wrapped in a sheet, presumably he's sleeping there, who runs away naked. Now, putting it together, and this is purely personal speculation, I actually I can imagine a scenario where Peter and John, although they're not named here in Matthew's Gospel, Peter and John go into the town, go into Jerusalem. They go down to, and they see a young man carrying the water. It may have been something, I suspect it's something that Jesus has by revelation. I was mentioning to folks just before we started that on Saturday we're hosting an Alpha Away Day, and at the end of the Away Day we're using some clips of video about life being lived by the Holy Spirit. And there's one from a little video series which is called Father of Lights, if anyone's seen it, where the guy travels with his camera with an Indian evangelist, and the Indian evangelist wakes up and says, well, today we're going to go to this town, and the Lord's shown me we're going to meet a man wearing an orange shirt and with a white beard. He has a white beard and he's wearing orange. So this is what the Indian evangelist says. So they get on the motorbike, they go down to this other town, they're standing around in the square looking around, and a Brahmin priest turns up with a white beard and an orange shirt. And the evangelist goes over and starts talking to him. It turns out that the Brahmin priest had a dream the night before that told him to go to this village to meet a man who had a message for him. It all captured on film, live. So it's one of those nice little moments of the Holy Spirit guiding. So I totally see there's something of this going on, that Jesus has wanted to obscure where they're eating until the last minute to the Passover meal. He sends John and Peter. He tells them to look out for when they get there, they'll identify someone who's there carrying a pitcher of water, which is a bit unusual. That person's going to then take them to a house, and the master of that house, the head of the household, will then be the host, and they'll eat the Passover there. When they get there, they're going to then go to Gethsemane, and it makes sense to me that possibly the young man the man they meet, who's not the head of the household, is perhaps the young man who's sleeping in Gethsemane at a time when there are loads of pilgrims there, and there are other people looking for accommodation, and maybe the upper room, which he might have otherwise been sleeping in, is being used for the Passover feast. And if that's the case, his name is John Mark. He's the gospel writer of Mark's gospel, but we know him as John Mark, and family names are very important. So actually, it could be that there's a John who is the head of that household, who is, if you like, in charge of the house. And actually that John could, therefore, Richard Bauckham could be right in the sense of he might become John the Elder, separate from John the Apostle, who's got that kind of that place and that character within the mix. So in a very unstructured way, what I'm trying to get across is I think there is a genuine spiritual prophetic moment that Jesus has that connects them with people, but people who are already to some degree disciples of Jesus. So the early church makes John Mark one of the 72, one of the wider group of disciples that have already started to follow Jesus. Which is probably why when they recognize him, oh yeah, there he is. and therefore even perhaps his father, because John Mark's house becomes a centre for maybe it's his father or an uncle, which is quite possible. If John Mark's first name John is following a usual convention, the most common convention is he's named after an uncle. So there's a kind of a familial context there. We meet John Mark's mother in the same house in the book of Acts. So you can see all those little kind of connections and pieces. So it becomes a kind of combination of supernatural guidance and also relational kind of connections and maybe some conversations that have been had up to this point. But it all comes together in these verses. I'm looking, we've done 2 verses so far, so we need to kind of get on. So the disciples did as Jesus directed them, and they prepared the Passover, which would also mean they probably had to go into the temple to buy a sacrificed lamb and so on. They've done all of that work together. And evening came, and he was reclining with the 12. So we've kind of covered the whole day, going into town, perhaps buying the lamb first, then going on for seeing the young man that they may have recognised as part of the 72, but carrying a pitcher of water as the sign Jesus had given them, gone on, met maybe the wider family, the person who's in charge of the household, and they've arranged it there. And while they were eating, he said to them, "Seriously, I tell you, one of you will betray me." Now Matthew doesn't go into. He's telling the story as part of the transition of Judas's betrayal. So he doesn't give us all the details which we get, for instance, in John's Gospel, where most of our details come from, that goes on in the Last Supper. We get a few more details in Luke, but not as much as in John. But this is very speedy and quick, and the focus really is on just 2 things. One is Judas's denial, kind of preparing. While they're there, he explains that one of you, seriously, I'll tell you, one of you will betray me. But being deeply upset, each began to profess to him, "It's not me, is it, Lord?" And he answered, "Someone who's dipped his hand in the bowl with me, the same will betray me," which is we often imagine it because there's a point where Jesus takes the bread and dips it and passes it to Judas. But when Jesus actually says these words at this stage, the bowl in this sense could be just even the washing bowl to wash hands. But the point is, it's someone who is there relationally, as a key member of this intimate meal, which is had between friends, and it's one of you. So it really is, seriously, I'm telling you, it really is. Even though you're all sitting there saying no, it isn't. It's someone who's that intimate that we've shared either the dipping into the juices, which happens, or whether it was even just the washing bowl at the beginning. That someone who's close. And then he goes on, in fact, the Son of Man goes, i.e. he's going to depart from this world, just as it is written about him. So Jesus makes a very clear reference to something about to happen, and that he's conscious of the scriptural background. And I should have checked it before we started today, but which of the psalm that actually talks that who's lifted his foot against me, which Matthew doesn't tell us, my close friend, which is part of that phrase, that there's something about the closeness here, and you are my close friends, and we see that that actually scripturally, prophetically, it's one of those close friends that will betray me, so it is going to happen. But then Jesus gives that, but woe betide the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. And it's not a curse, it's a warning, which I think is, I always want to kind of emphasize, is it seems to me, particularly when you put all of the Gospels together, and the way that Jesus talks, he is almost trying to appeal the whole time to what's going on in Judas. And we're told that he's known from the beginning who would betray him. From the moment, effectively, it's entered into Judas's heart. So he's aware that it's Judas. He's constantly trying to appeal to him in a way that looks as though it's trying to turn his behaviour, although he recognises that he will still betray him. But I think what Jesus is actually trying to do is to get across that Judas's betrayal doesn't have to mean his eternal lostness. It's hard when we read John's Gospel, because particularly the English translations will talk about the one doomed to destruction to fulfill the scripture. But the point I've regularly made is there is no scripture that says the one who betrays Jesus will be eternally lost. There's just scripture that says one of his close friends will betray him. And actually within this mix, we see Jesus is going to highlight that there's a betrayal or a failure by every one of his disciples coming. It's just one of them in particular who needs to hear the warning. It'd be better if they hadn't been betrayed. This is a huge moment for Judas, and he is not going to come back from it. But I think it's encouraging to see, if you like, the sense of Jesus quietly trying to appeal and warn and to give the potential for another opportunity, and even to flag that it is possible to read the betrayal texts without having to go to the end and the completion, which is the eternal lostness, where Jesus then does pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, none of them is lost except the one. And at that point it seems something is now fixed in Judas. It's so certain it's no longer changeable. But in these last few hours before that moment, there's this kind of conversation that and there's a warning and so on. So now Judas, who was betraying him, said, "It's not me, is it, Rabbi?" Now, if I quickly go back to the previous slide, you're saying that the disciples are all sitting around saying, "It's not me, is it, Lord?" And actually, although Rabbi is a term of honour, it's less personal honour. It's more of a title. It's kind of, well, you do that. There's a lot of rabbis out there. So actually the shift in his language, which is identical phrase except for the word master has been replaced with rabbi. And Jesus said to him, "So you say," or kind of, "Well, you said it." And even within those interchanges, we kind of see the struggle going on, and the possibility perhaps for Judas. So while they were eating, Jesus took bread. Now, as we put this together with the other Gospels, we see that Judas has left by this stage. Matthew doesn't highlight that in his telling of the story, He's just, but because what he's emphasizing is, if you like, this is the completion, the sealing of Judas's decision to betray Jesus, which now probably does lock him in to where he's got to. So while they were eating, Jesus took bread and gave a blessing, and he broke it. And this actually, as I say, it happens after Judas has left, but we don't know that from Matthew. Having gave it, sorry, that's terrible, isn't it? Having given it to his disciples, he said, "Take, this is my body." Next, he took a cup. Sometimes you'll see it says the cup, but the Greek doesn't say the. It just has next he took cup. It's the indefinite article. And that, again, it makes sense as the more I've looked at these things, is each of them would have had a cup. And there are 4 times when they raise their glasses effectively and drink to different elements of the Exodus. And there are various statements from the Exodus that they celebrate. And so it's that same cup which is referred to on the table as the cup of salvation in Jewish thinking, i.e. the cup of Jesus, who is salvation. Jesus takes probably his cup, but here, instead of them all taking their individual cups, he asks them to pass it around. So drink from this one, all of you. And so there is a very subtle shifting of a moment that comes from the kind of the Passover celebration, which is the raising of a cup each 4 times during the evening as they remember aspects of that God does for them in the Exodus and their salvation. They take what's referred to in the rabbinic writings as the cup of salvation, and they drink from it. But now Jesus takes it up, drinks from it, but passes it on and says to all of them, "Drink from it, all of you," which is slightly different and therefore probably gets their attention. "For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And we know the phrase so well because it's used so often as we take communion, but here we actually see in a very subtle way Jesus is building on what's already there, but he's taking it to a new step. The first Exodus took the Israelites into the first covenant, but the new Exodus, which there's a slight modification, it comes down to one man, but they all share from the one man, or from one cup. They all share now from the one cup, and this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Some manuscripts don't have the word new, but I've left it in there. It's there in some, and it's obviously the emphasis that is intended here. So I tell you that from now on, I will not drink the fruit of the vine like this until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. And having sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Again, when we've done these things through, we actually know the various psalms that are sung during the evening. So if you actually read, if you want to check those out, I can't remember them because I should have written them down so I could just spill them out to you. You look at it. It's Psalm 118, and it talks about binding the festival sacrifice to the horns of the altar. The word horns are the spurs or the bits that stick out of it, and of course Jesus is going to be pinned on the spurs that stick out from a cross during the festival. So it's a very relevant kind of psalm that they actually probably would sing at the end of the meal. And from there they go out to the Mount of Olives. And so Matthew goes on. We often translate simply as just then, but the then is sometimes translated as at that time, because in the Hebrew way of telling of things, it doesn't necessarily mean exactly afterwards. It means in this process, how I'm telling you. It's something that happens within the flow of this, but it's about then. And if we mix this with John's Gospel, we'll see some of these words probably happening while they're still eating the Last Supper. But Matthew's kind of getting the fact they're now on their way to Gethsemane. If Gethsemane is part of, if you like, the estate of the household which is hosting the Last Supper, which is perhaps why John is down there, it would be obvious to Judas before he leaves where it is that they're going to go to finish the evening to pray. So although he's left, that's the case. So they're now on their way according to Matthew, but the conversation has already been going on because it's more vague. It's at that sort of time, i.e. was it before they left, was it as they left, or is it as they're going? Can't tell. You will all fail and fall on account of me. The word there is scandalize or scandalizo. You'll be scandalized. So you sometimes see it translated as offended, sometimes stumble, sometimes fall, but it has both ideas. It's kind of an embarrassing slip up. So I've gone for fail and fall on this translation. You'll fail and fall on account of me this very night, because it has been written. So again, it's just as it was written. This is going to happen. One of you is going to betray me, because that's what Scripture says. It would be better actually if you didn't, and please hear this warning. Now I'm saying, and it's been written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Therefore understand, you will all fail and run away. You will all betray me. You will all leave me. But he goes on and says, after, however, my being risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And so we have that fantastic little statement, which is going to be kind of almost missed by the disciples, but Jesus is explicit with them here. As we read the wider, more extended version in John, we see Jesus talks about him going away and coming back and so on. So, but the idea is there in the mix. It's dropped in. I'll be going ahead of you to Galilee. And the key thing he wants to get across here, I think Matthew wants to get across, with Peter's permission, because I think Matthew's gospel, as we've seen, emerging at a time when the disciples are all together in Jerusalem, is representing their collective account of the story, even though it's written by Matthew. And so Peter then is presenting the fact, or they are presenting the fact, that actually all of the disciples are going to fail Jesus, not just the betrayal of Judas. And Peter in particular is going to fail in a spectacular way, but Peter is able to find a place back to restoration. And that's part of the story that is there in Matthew, becomes more explicit, of course, as we go on through the book of Acts. That Peter's betrayal and failure and falling, stumbling, the scandal he creates, could have been very similar to Judas's, except that Peter's heart brings him back. Judas's heart has set him on a course that he never comes back from. So Peter makes the statement, I will never fail. So Jesus said to him, truly I say to you, during this night, before cock crowing, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I won't deny you. And all the disciples said likewise. And then the last verse, then they came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and I've just put in brackets, which means oil press. So it's a working garden. It's a garden which is a little agricultural factory where the olives are pressed to produce oil. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go further on and pray. And that's where we're going to leave it. We'll pick up here next time. But it's kind of fitting as we've seen, as we've kind of gone through this flow where Matthew has portrayed the woman who we understand as Mary, who recognises what's happening to Jesus and has honoured him by pouring oil over his head. That's become, if you like, the straw that breaks the camel's back for Judas, and he takes up what's perhaps already been a conversation with the authorities, with an agreement to betray Jesus. As we've gone on, the next morning Jesus has set up where they're going to eat Passover in a way that it's not clear to Judas. So even though during the day as they will all go into the temple probably to pray, he has time to make contact with the priests. He can't tell them exactly where the Passover is going to be eaten until they come together in the evening, and he's now with them. We hear and see the appeal of Jesus in that process, and flagging that actually there is a pressure coming on them, which is going to shatter them all, scatter them all to some degree. They're all going to fail Jesus. But for the one who makes the ultimate, have they set themselves on a course they can't come back to? And we finish then, as we kind of finally get there, with the arrival at the oil press, which kind of almost symbolises the pressure that they're coming under. And as we will understand the imagery as it presses in on Jesus as he makes his final choices to face the cross. And so we finish with the sit here, I'll go further and pray. Jesus knows what he needs to do at this stage. So there we go. We'll finish there. I think my next slide is, there you go. Thanks for watching. Does anyone want to ask anything or make a comment as we get to this stage?